Hi everybody, it's Honest John again. In 1968, a documentary called Hunger in America aired. Now, before this documentary, most Americans thought that starvation was occurring in places like Africa and other foreign countries, but this documentary showed Americans all over this country living on the edge of starvation. And Richard Nixon responded. He created programs such as food stamps and enhanced the school lunch program, and by the time he left office, hunger had actually been almost entirely eliminated in this country. But we know that's not the case today, so what happened? Ronald Reagan happened. Now, Nixon has been much reviled and Reagan has been lionized, but despite Watergate, Nixon did a lot more good than harm. Reagan's a different story. Reagan made massive cuts to these programs. His solution was private charity. Of course, any sane and reasonable man would have known that the problem was way beyond the scope of anything private charity could handle. But we didn't have a sane and reasonable man in office. We had Reagan. And by the time he left office, people living in poverty in America had increased by a third. But even with all these cuts, Reagan still managed to triple the national debt. He did this through a massive expansion of the military and huge tax cuts for the rich. Now, later on he saw that the debt and the deficit was getting way out of hand. So he raised taxes 7 times, but not once on the rich. All of those tax increases were on the middle class. And then he deregulated the savings and loan industry, which immediately, almost immediately, led to a huge scandal, a crash, and a recession. Tax cuts for the rich, deregulation, and a recession. So it seems to be a familiar thing. Yeah. It seems to happen mostly when Republicans are running the country, doesn't it? And these tax cuts, along with his anti-labor and anti-union policies, began the trend towards income inequality, which is the largest problem in our economy today. So Reagan was the man who brought starvation back to America and began the decline of the middle class. His administration also ignored the AIDS crisis until over 26,000 Americans had died. And by the time he left office, 115,786 people had been diagnosed with AIDS and over 70,000 had died. He also ignored evidence of climate change, which was presented to his administration. Imagine how much further along we'd be if he'd have pushed just a little bit for the development of alternative fuels. That was the 1980s. It was a long time ago. We'd be a lot further along. But that would have required vision, and Reagan was not a man of vision. Reagan also funded the terrorist Contra organization against the democratically elected government in Nicaragua. His administration was responsible for massacres in both of those countries. And he funded them by selling weapons to Iran, our biggest enemy. I think it's the first time in history that one could say that the President of the United States was guilty of treason. And Reagan, he called the Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. Reagan also deployed Marines to Lebanon with no mission plan. No plan at all. They went there and they didn't know what they were supposed to do. And the result was 241 deaths. And us retreating out of there with our tail between our legs and becoming the laughingstock of the world. Somehow this does seem to be a pattern when Republicans run the country. The world just can't stop laughing at us. Reagan supported the apartheid rule in South Africa. Desmond Tutu called him the pits as far as blacks are concerned. Oh, and the Reagan administration was one of the most corrupt in history. 138 appointees of the Reagan administration resigned due to some kind of scandal. There were 31 convictions, and there would have been more, but they were pardoned. And let's not forget, while he was in California, Reagan ratted on his fellow actors to Joe McCarthy's thugs. And the thing that he's given so much credit for, the fall of the Soviet Union, Reagan had nothing to do with that. Pretty speeches do not bring down a nation. It was their internal weaknesses and incompetent leaders. And Reagan just happened to be sitting in the Oval Office at the time. As a matter of fact, he was just as incompetent as the Soviet leaders, but America was in far better shape. Unfortunately, years of conservative economics have left us in almost as bad a shape as the USSR was before the collapse. So what did his contemporaries think of him? The people that worked with him, that knew him best. Jim Cannon, an aide to Howard Baker, said that Reagan aides used to tell stories about how inept the president was. All he wanted to do was watch movies and television at the residence. Francois Mitterrand asked, what planet is he living on? During this trip to Europe, he was so often seen falling asleep at meetings and during speeches, even during a one-on-one meeting with the Pope, that the foreign press called the trip the Big Sleep. Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce. Larry Speakes, Reagan's press secretary, said getting Reagan ready for a press conference was like reinventing the wheel. Margaret Thatcher said there's nothing between his ears. Even Reagan's daughter, Patricia, said he has the ability to make statements that are so far outside the parameters of logic that they leave you speechless. Julian Bond, in talking about Reagan's relationship with black people, said that the Reagan years were a time best forgotten. And I was very active and aware during the Reagan years. And you know what they were called? The era of lowered expectations. And believe me, Reagan lived up to that. So let's hear a few things from the old coot himself. Here are a few memorable Reagan quotes. A tree's a tree. How many more do you need to look at? All the waste in the air from a nuclear reactor can be stored under a desk. Fascism was really the basis of the New Deal. Reagan called Medicaid recipients a faceless mass awaiting handouts. And unemployment insurance, he called it a prepaid vacation for freeloaders. Sounds a lot like Mitt Romney there, doesn't he? Doesn't seem like the Republicans have made much progress since the 80s. Here are a few more. We were told 17 million people went to bed hungry. They were on a diet. Reagan also said that trees and plants were responsible for pollution. And don't forget, it was Reagan who decided that ketchup was a vegetable. Actually, ketchup ain't a vegetable, but Reagan was pretty close to being one. Oh, here's a quote from before he was president. "We're doing better in the war in Vietnam than we have been told." Oh yeah, right there. So there is the myth of Reagan and the reality. The truth about Reagan is that he was all image. Underneath that image was an inept, stupid, amoral, and thoroughly despicable man. The reason he's so adored by the right is because they're as bad as he was. Thanks for listening. It's the one.